All right, folks, we are back. This is video 5, I believe. This is crazy. I had originally done, when they first came out, a few videos with just the audio or the recording from the courthouse. This is crazy how long this is. We are halfway through, 84 through 175. But I don't want to shortchange you guys on any part here because it's so fascinating on so many levels for so many of our audiences. Okay, people reach out to me. I work with detectives every day. I work with forensic genetic genealogists. I work with lab people. I do get calls from defense attorneys. I get calls from prosecutors. Civil attorneys. This is, you got to know. So this is, as we start getting these first cases through with the forensic genetic genealogy, we have to all learn from them, okay, to push it through. The next case that I'll tackle is the Rex Harriman case. Now, that didn't go to trial either. Maybe they're scared of the genetic genealogy, which they should be. But, yeah, so we'll see. So we left off. This is in the Brian Kohberger case. My name's Christine Burke. I'm a forensic genetic genealogist, retired police detective and sergeant. I'm a private investigator, and I'm a law enforcement expert witness. And so this is all in my thing. I don't know what's going on with this video, so I'll try to remember to not blur myself out here. But this was a hearing that they had before Brian Kohberger pled guilty. They were challenging the forensic genetic genealogy. And we heard from the detective, I can't remember his name, the lead detective on the case from Moscow, Idaho police. And we heard from, I believe it's Raylene Nowlin, from the Idaho State Police. She was the lab manager. Okay, so now we had stopped off. Now we are going to Ms. Taylor, who is Mr. Kohberger's defense attorney, is interviewing, has Matthew Gamette on the stand. Okay, so he gets sworn in here, and I gotta hold on. Yeah, I don't need it. I thought I had my computer audio off, but I don't need that as long as I have my directional thing here. Okay, so he gets sworn in. Oh, okay, and he's also employed with the Idaho State Police Forensic Services. Now, I haven't read this, so I'm getting shocked. Shocked just as much as you are. And he's a laboratory system director. So Miss Nowlin was the manager, and he's the lab system director. So we're not exactly sure what that is yet. I'm an investigator. I'm not the lab. I call them affectionately lab rats. Okay. So I don't know a lot about the labs in that fashion from the day-to-day life of the labs. I just know how I interact with them from the police labs when I was in the police department. And now as a forensic genetic genealogist. Okay, so she's asking him, what does it mean to be laboratory system director? He oversees purchasing, procurement, contracts, HR issues, hiring, terminations. He also oversees how the lab operates day to day. Sounds like a lot. She asks him how long he's held that role. He's been with the Idaho, now he's been with the, semantics is important. He's been with the Idaho State Police Forensic Services for 16 years, in this current role for 10. Semantics. You always have to watch, especially in court things, how folks are answering. Not that they're trying to lie, but you need to make sure that you get your question answered. Okay? So she asked, does he have prior experience? He says he does. He worked for Washington State Patrol as a DNA, it says analysis, I think analyst, and also a crime scene responder. So a crime scene responder is somebody who goes out. Most of the people in the lab don't go out. And in video 4, I gave a good frustrated discussion about, I think it was video 4, about how there's a disconnect between, for my detectives, there's a disconnect between what's happening out on the street and the end result in the labs through a lack of, we'll say, communication. Okay. So he has a bachelor's degree from Brigham Young, master's degree from Brigham Young, and continuing certificates. I don't know what that is. Maybe continuing education from West Virginia University and UC Davis. Now, UC Davis has a good lab over there. We're not sure if he was involved in that. I'm told from my scientist friends that there's a great lab over there. So he gets asked, are you involved in the collaborative group NTVIC? He is. What is that group? The National Technology Implementation Collaborative. That's a mouthful, huh? And he chairs that group. So she asks, as it relates to forensic investigative genetic genealogy, I call it FGG or FGG or forensic genetic genealogy. She's asking him, what does that group, this NTIC, have with genetic genealogy? And he says, so currently we have several different subcommittees in our forensic investigative genetic genealogy group. Sounds like a big collaboration. What the group is focused on is anything from policies, procedures, contracts, things of that nature, looking at the implementation of that technology into public forensic science laboratories for the police labs, I believe. I don't know exactly what public forensic science laboratories are. I would assume paid for by the public, which is typically our police labs. Okay. So she asks why, the defense asks, why is this important? He says, why is the work of the group important? She says, let me ask the question better. Why is it important to have policies and procedures? And he says, in any public forensic science laboratory, we want to make sure we implement technology well, that we implement it in a robust way, that it can be relied on for things such as courts. And so we always want to make sure that when we're implementing a technology, means starting to use, that we take a look at how that technology is being used and we apply it well in the public laboratory space. So that ain't for everybody. That's the public laboratory space. And the defense asks, is that important for public trust? He says, I believe so, yes. She asks, are there any other organizations that you're involved in course of your work? Yes, I'm involved with several other forensic science organizations. How about ASCLD? I don't know how to pronounce that. Yes. What is that one? The American Society of Crime Lab Directors. What is the purpose of that group? So that's the group of laboratory directors. It could be laboratory managers, right? That would be Raylene Nowlin, I believe. Quality managers, laboratory leaders, in essence, are members of that organization. Kind of sounds good, right? They're going to represent various specialties within the lab. And so she asks, what is your role with that group? And he says, currently, I report to the board of directors as the CFSO. Goodness gracious, are you lost? The Consortium of Forensic Science Organizations Liaison for the Organization for the American Society of Crime Lab Directors. So apparently there's another group, the Consortium of Forensic Science Organization, and he represents the American Society of Crime Lab Directors at the CFSO. Okay, that's what I got from that. Okay. She asked, did you have a role in deciding that Othram Labs should contract with the Idaho State Police Forensic Labs? He says, yes, he did have a role. And she inquires further And he says, my role would be as the laboratory system director making a decision on contracts that would be awarded. So maybe, because we heard from Miss Nowlin, maybe Miss Nowlin did the secretarial to and fro, putting the request for proposals up there, and he made the decision, Mr. Gamette. Gamette. Okay. So, okay, but no, sorry, we're wrong. Did you decide that Othram should receive the contract? I did not. Did you work on the contract with Othram? He says, I need to answer that question in a little bit different way than you asked it, if you'll give me some leeway. Sure. He says, I did not work specifically on the contract with Othram. However, I worked on the specifications that led to a contract being awarded to Othram. So it sounds like maybe he worked with Miss Nowlin to determine, remember, they had to tell all the labs that were competing, the ISP, that's the Idaho State Police, had to tell them what they wanted, right? Like when you, this is a bad analogy, but like when you go to the restaurant to order your dinner, you need to tell them what you want and how you want it, right? If you don't want it the normal way, you say, I don't want this, I want this, okay? So that's what he's saying. So she asked, the specifications you work on, did those end up being part of the contract with Othram? Yes. What were those specifications? He says, so there were a lot of specifications within the scope of work. Now, the scope of work is the thing, it's a formal term. It's like the order, okay? It's the how you want your food prepared. Okay? It's the scope, okay? That's what they call it in like the business. It's what is the scope that we're working on? And if you think about it, I don't know, this just popped in my head, you know, like a telescope zooming in. So you're only looking at the piece. We don't want all this, we want this, or I was thinking this thing, you know, you're zooming in. I don't know, hopefully you can see me. You're zooming in and you only want the right, so it takes out everything else. You're focused in. Okay. So he says, so there were a lot of specifications with the scope that we developed to send out for general bid process. As we bid, as a state agency, as we bid for a contract, we send out specifications that anyone has to comply with as they give us their documents and responses back on those things. Then we have the ability to look at and make sure that they are compliant with those specifications that we have sent out. So if you haven't done an RFP, it can be tedious, and it could be stupid things that are very annoying down to paper size and things like that. And then, you know, it's just everybody's different. Like ordering your food, you're going to eat your food different than somebody else. Okay? So they're going to ask for what they're going to ask for. So the defense says, what were the specifications for Othram? He says, there were a lot of specifications sent out on the request for proposals, intent to bid. It's like they're placing their order. Here's what I want to eat, okay? There were a lot of different specifications that we sent out. Again, I have a recollection of some of them. I don't have a full memory of all of them. And that's important because I think I told you in a other video, when you're on the stand, they want you to remember. They don't want you to have to read a report. So she says, share with us what you remember. He says, so things in that contract would specify that they use the interim policy. Now, we talked about that in, I believe it was video 4, and that's the DOJ guidelines. And those apply. Go watch that video. I'm not a fan, and I talked about that, but he specified they use that policy. Now, we don't know if that's because they got funds or they don't have funds. If you're a detective listening to this, you didn't listen to the other one, Go listen to the other one or call me because, yeah. Okay, so anyway. So he continues, we also would put things in there about them following environmental protection type provisions the federal government requires us to abide by. Okay. It also would have other things like reporting requirements back to us. Remember, we talked about those reports. Billing procedures, a lot of different conditions we put in that to specify how they are going to work with us. She says, when you say interim policy, are you referring to the Department of Justice interim policy? Yes. Did you care if they were an accredited lab? He says, so at this time, we were looking for a forensic investigative genetic genealogy vendor or company to provide these services for us. We were not aware of any companies at that time that were accredited. Again, new technology. Not everybody is accredited. You can argue, do you really need accreditation? Okay, and that's a different video. That's a different conversation. If you need, I'm not giving you a legal opinion here. If you need a legal opinion, call me. But this question comes up a lot. So she continues, since that time, though, are you aware that companies do become accredited? He says, absolutely. Currently, there are definitely companies that are accredited in these services. At this time the contract was bid, there were none to my knowledge. She continues, defense. Did you look at the procedures and protocols of Othram before you decided? He says, so I don't recall specifically myself reviewing those criteria. I know that there were manuals, protocols that were provided back to us as part of that bid. Generally, I would provide those to others within our laboratory that were more qualified than I was at looking at specific technology, and I am not qualified in FGG analysis. So Ms. Nowlin is not, and he is not from what they're saying to us. Do you understand that? That's what I get. Okay. So defense continues. Do you recall if their instruments were validated? I don't recall. So you can have the whole thing, meeting standards, and each individual piece of equipment meeting standards. Okay, here's a good example. Police department being accredited. Are police departments accredited? No, not a lot of them. Okay, but there's this thing called CALEA, and they accredit police departments. So some police departments are CALEA accredited. That would be the overall thing, the overall department. But radar guns, the old ones used to go like this. Radar guns, I heard gun. Radar guns get calibrated. They get tested. Vehicle speed. I mean, things get calibrated. Breathalyzers, things within the big police department. Okay, so now she's going to was overall Othram accredited. Now are their instruments, their tools accredited, validated? He says, I don't recall. She says, would that be important to have their instruments validated? And he says, validation is up to each laboratory and how they accomplish that. I can't speak to the working practices of Othram Laboratories. So now she says, does Idaho State Police Forensics Lab validate their equipment? Yes, we do. And I think where she's going here is typically when you want something from somebody, say, I'm going to hire a contractor. I want them to have a minimum and equivalent to me, most of the times in competency and insurance, usually. So they meet you or they're better. Okay, hopefully they're better. That's why you're going to them. So I think she might be going here. Most agencies, when they hire, they ask you to meet the same level, because sometimes in insurance coverage, you won't be covered if your subcontractors don't have the same coverage. I don't know if you guys know that, but yeah. So you got to look at the insurance. That's just a part of it, and that could be why the defense is saying, did you think to make sure that they were on par with what you had? Because if it's good enough for you, is it good enough for them? Okay, just a question. All right. So he says he validates their equipment, and she says, is that important that you do that? To us, as an accredited laboratory, yes, that's an important part, and it may be required. We don't know what his accreditation requirements are. Okay? We can apply the same thing to police departments. Are police departments that are accredited required to do different things than police departments that are not accredited? She continues, how about retention of data or the ability to go back and rebuild the work or look at the work was done? He says, so we retain, in our cases, we retain our electronic data. We retain any other notes and things that we make as part of our case records, part of our case file. We provide those to the investigators and to the court as a normal business practice. Now that could be called work product. It could be called metadata. It could be called evidence. Okay, so he's saying they give that to the investigators, and when they say the court, they're talking about the prosecutor and the court for the court file, like the judge, right, when it's in trial. Okay. So she says, did Othram do that? And he says, in this case, I believe they gave us a report, or what was identified as a preliminary report. The contract specifies that they would keep any data or other things associated with that. Okay? So what they're saying is, whatever they used, whatever they did to come up with that report should be preserved. Okay? Whatever got them, and it's kind of like a chain of custody in a sense. Whatever led them to that conclusion, to that testing outcome, to that opinion, all of that, you have to keep that. That's what happens when you go to court. You have to build your case, okay? So he says, for our purposes, remember we're talking about the contract, the contract scope. For our purposes, we were most concerned that the data or anything else not be released to other parties, because it's an active police case, just in a minimum. That's one reason for that, I can tell you right off the bat. And so our concern was more about data security, data privacy. And it could be because he's the systems guy, whatever. So he says, and so in this case, I don't know if they have other data or other records that they have kept, they have retained. We had asked them as part of the termination in this casework, because I don't remember what video it was, 2, 3, Othram was removed from the Kohberger case. So he's talking about termination, like we're not working with you anymore, that they would preserve those things, or that they would communicate with both the prosecutor's office and with the Moscow Police Department if any of that information was supposed to be disposed or whatnot, okay? So maybe they didn't give it directly to ISP, but they said, you better hang on to it, okay? So defense says, okay, keep it or tell somebody before you get rid of it. She's trying to clarify because, I kind of could be semantic, could be the same, but if they just, send you a note and then they get rid of it and you don't have time to, right? Okay. So he says, our specification was that it stopped our process with them, meaning don't do any more work. That we were no longer in a contractual obligation with them on this case. Now, it sounds like they got paid, right? Sounds like, from what Ms. Nowlin said, that they got paid on a preliminary report. Okay. So when you have a contractual obligation, like more money could have been spent because of the contract. So he wanted to make sure, he was like, hey, no more, we're not, whoa, okay? Essentially, this is what he's saying. We were transferring ownership of anything on this case between them and Moscow Police Department and the prosecutor's office. That doesn't make sense. Transferring it to who? Okay, I don't understand that. Okay, so the defense asks, the report that you ended up receiving from them, are you aware that that report doesn't provide details of how they did their work? And he says, I have seen the report. Yes, I have seen what was in the report. Now, what did she ask about the scope? I was looking for the part where I thought I read that they make sure that they could reproduce it. Do you remember that? Sorry, I just want to go through here. Okay, this is where she asked, how about this is talking about confirming the processes of the vendor that ISP would have retained. And the defense asked him, how about retention of data or the ability to go back and rebuild the work or look at the work was done? And he said, so we retain, in our cases, we retain our electronic data, we retain other notes and things that we make as part of our case records, part of our case file. We provide those to investigators and to the court as a normal business practice. Okay, then I talked to you about insurance levels, just as an example, that everybody has the same process. And I will tell you, because I've had to come in and step in on these cases, you have to be able, this is what I train, you have to be able to reproduce. They're talking about science, and I'm not a scientist, but I know from Lab 101 in school that you have to be able to reproduce the results. As a forensic genetic genealogist, I have to be able to, as a cop, okay, but we'll talk about FGG first. I have to be able to go and read your report and go through your data and know exactly what you had to work with, why you did what you did, and how you came to that conclusion. And I should, just like in anything dealing with science, because FGG deals with science, it's an investigation, but it has a scientific component to it, that the science should be verifiable. And how that science was used in an investigation. Okay, let me try to give you an example why this is important to me. Let's say, I don't know if this isn't a technically good example because you could be impaired, but let's say, just as an example, a DUI is over 0.10. We're going just on the straight mechanics of it. And somebody blows 0.4. Okay, okay. So given the same situation, if somebody gets arrested for a 0.4 and somebody was able to go through the same process, they better darn well get a 0.4, not a 0.02. Because a 0.02, and don't get into the impairment part, we're talking about the strict number on a DUI. If it says 0.10 and there's a 0.02, that doesn't meet the number. So it has to be, it's like a recipe. Everybody needs to come out with their recipe on the same thing. So that's what she's talking about here. Okay. So, so that's huge that they didn't provide details of how they did their work. So she says, defense attorney, and it's troubling for me. Would you agree that what's in the report is far different than what the Idaho State Police Forensic Lab produces by way of notes and photographs in connections with its work? Okay, so we'll go for the lipstick again. Hopefully you can see this because camera. When you have a piece of evidence, like let's say you're taking, okay, let's do this. We go back old school. This is gum, but let's say this is your crack rock, okay? Because this has happened. This has happened. Okay. We're having fun. We're having show and tell. Okay. And you pop the guy and he's got 3 crack rocks. Okay, we got 3 crack rocks here. And the officer's report said that he had 3 crack rocks. And then you go and you look at the lab photo. I mean, you need a photo to see if there's 3 crack rocks, and there's only 1 rock. What happened? It tells you something's wrong. So you pulled out the wrong bag. Somebody labeled the wrong bag. Somebody wrote the report wrong. Like all kinds of, okay? So you take photos, among other things. Okay, that's the simplest demonstration of there. Okay. So, so you take a picture, especially if you have an evidence item, say this lipstick, and maybe they're going to try to get DNA off the wand. You're going to take a picture because if I come in and look at the case as a prosecutor or a defense attorney or anybody, I need to know what brand of lipstick. What did it look like? Was it a double one? Was it a single one? What year was it from? Right? You need to know exactly what it was from start to finish. So he says, we were not provided with analytical notes. We were not provided with data to my knowledge. We were provided with what was identified to me as a preliminary report which contained some of their genealogical work on the case and other things such as potential nationalities. Now, let me tell you, that is a far cry from an ID. I've seen some of their reports, quite a few, but that I know what he's saying. I'm not going to say anything here, but that's a far cry from an ID. So I don't know, like, how did you get from here to there, right? How is somebody going to jail for a crack rock? You can tell I'm an old school cop. How is someone going to jail for a crack rock and you don't have no crack rock in the case, in the evidence? It's a problem. Okay, anyway, sorry. So he said he only got some of their genealogical work and some other things, such as potential nationalities. The defense asks, is that different than what you produce when you produce a report at your lab? Now he says, which I kind of felt maybe this is coming, because remember, he doesn't do forensic genetic genealogy. And this is where, what do they say? Caveat emptor. For my detectives, again, who are listening to this, and my lab people, if you're listening to this, buyer, is it caveat emptor? Buyer beware. Y'all do not know what you're buying. And this is why I started my company in 2021. Sorry, this is not related to these cases, but this is vitally important. And this is why I scream it from the rooftops. Y'all have no idea what you're buying. He didn't know what he's scoping. Okay, they're the committees and all that, right? So you don't know what you're buying. So how do you know that you're getting the right thing back? Okay, it's like taking your car in and say it's rattling, and then you come out with a $15,000 bill later. You don't know. You're not a mechanic. You have to take their word for it. No, you become an educated consumer, and that is my role. I walk you through, either I do your case for you or I walk you through the entire process, because we ain't going to have that happen. Okay, anyway, let me go back to this. Okay, so he's saying, the lab guy is saying, it's hard for me to answer that question because it's a different report. It's a different type of analysis. And can you hear that? I don't know. It's not a fart. It's a whatever. So he says, I can tell you in our DNA reports, which are STR, we release the report, we release the analyst notes. As a general practice, we have the electronic data, could be metadata, and other things available for disclosure. But that's our general practice. I can't speak to the process as Othram Labs and what they disclose, nor can I speak to what is normal for a release in a forensic genetic genealogy case. Well, my question, don't know if it's your question, my question would be, did you think about that when you scoped it out for RFP? Okay, anyway. Defense continues. Are you familiar with how you come up with a SNP, SMP? With the process where you get from a DNA sample to a SNP? He says, in general, but I'm not qualified in forensic genetic genealogy analysis. She says, okay, I won't go too far with that. Are you familiar with how you get from a DNA sample to an STR sample for the lab's purposes? Yes. Now remember, STR is CODIS. It's not forensic genetic genealogy. Forensic genetic genealogy requires different output, different testing, different, whole different enchilada. Okay? So she says, are there similarities between the two processes from getting pieces of DNA to an end result profile that you can use? Yeah, you got a piece of evidence, you take whatever it is off, blood, urine, hair, skin, right? You got to take it off the evidence, then you got to do stuff with it. And then does it go to STR or does it go to IGG? Okay? So he says similarities in process as far as extraction, that's the taking off of, quantitation of DNA, what do we have to work with? How much do we have to work with? Because remember, in a previous video, we talked about, are we going with fingerprints? Are we going, like, sometimes you only get one choice. And that's it. You got to make a decision. So he says, but as far as the instrumentation used, methods, and those kinds of things, that's a very different process. Okay, so he can get it off the material and tell you how much DNA is there, which he would do before he sent it to STR. So he can tell you that, but once it goes over to the FGG division, he don't know. Okay. So the defense says, so some of the documents that the Idaho State Police Forensics Lab produces that show us those results, those would be similar to what you would expect to see with a SNP. Again, that's the FGG process. And he says, I would assume, again, I'm not qualified in FGG analysis, so I can't speak to what documents they may or may not produce. So I think where she's trying to go with, at the preliminary step before it goes over to FG or over to STR or over to FGG, she's trying to say, what did you get off the item? Did you get blood? Did you get urine? Did you get hair? What did you get? And how much did you get? That's where I think she's saying that, but I don't know. Okay. So she says, let's move from there. Thank you for that. And let's talk about Othram being involved in the case that winds up being why we're here today. What communication did you have with Othram on the early end of that process? So he says, so to my recollection, our early communication on this case was providing them with the DNA that they would be able to develop, hopefully an investigative lead for us on a case. After that sample, to my knowledge, had been that we had followed our processes through and that we had put a sample into CODIS, that we had not received any hits off CODIS, and then we would proceed with the next step of testing. We did have a contractual relationship with them since early in, I believe, 2021, so we did have a contract in place. So what he's talking about is they, the Idaho State Police, pulled, for lack of a better analogy, pulled the pieces off the evidence item, extracted the DNA, and had however much they had. Let's say that's totally wrong, but just for your visual, they had a half a cup of DNA, and they poured some out, and it went for STR testing, and they didn't get a hit. So now they have however much they have left, a quarter of a cup, and they want to do forensic genetic genealogy. So they're going to send that extract, this is what they call it, they're going to send it to Othram. Okay? Now remember, the contract says that in some cases, Othram can do the picking. But in this case, ISP did the picking, made the extract, used some of it for CODIS, got no hit, and then they gave it to Othram. Okay. So defense asks, was this the first case that Othram worked pursuant to that contract, meaning the FGG contract? He says, no, I don't believe so. She says, how did they get the DNA? He says the DNA sample itself, that would be the extract, the quarter cup of DNA. The DNA sample was delivered by Moscow Police Department in person to them at Othram Labs. So they went from Idaho to Texas to give it to Othram. And she asked, did you have any role in that part? He did. What did you do? Apparently he flew. I accompanied, well, I don't know if they drove, but I'm thinking they flew. Who knows? I accompanied the officer from Boise down to Houston and down to the Othram Laboratory. I didn't have possession of the sample, but I was with the investigator that day. So she says, after the sample was delivered, did you have communications with Othram further? Yes. What were those? So I had communications to my memory with them about what type of analysis we were asking them to do. The food order, remember my analogy, the food order. Also, what type of searching. I remember they asked specifically for consent to do certain types of searching. We had to authorize things through memos and whatnot of them doing certain searching. Specifically, I believe it was FamilyTreeDNA that they needed an authorization for. I remember having significant discussion with them about Y-STR testing and if or how it would be accomplished. She continues. Why did you want Othram to do Y-STR testing? So the reason for Y-STR testing is to utilize different investigative databases that might be out there. I don't believe in this case we ever did Y-STR testing. A lot of the discussion was around preservation of the sample, or as much of the sample we could preserve. And so our recommendation to them was not to proceed with that type of testing at this time, to kind of see where we were able to go with the traditional SNP testing with the whole genome sequencing, and then we would maybe potentially revisit Y-STR testing. Okay, so now you're hearing in that Y-STR. So that's in the middle. STR, Y-STR, FGG. Remember, we got our quarter cup of DNA that went down to them. And let's say the recipe takes a quarter cup and Y-STR takes an eighth of a cup. Well, if you do Y-STR, you're not going to have a quarter cup, right? So you got one shot. That's what I tell you. Sometimes you got one shot. So they said, we're going to go to FGG. Okay? All right. So then if they have any drips left, they're going to go to Y-STR. He also continues and he says, I do remember some discussion with David Mittelman at Othram about if they were able to bootstrap some of the whole genome sequencing in order to develop a Y profile that could be searchable from the data that they had already developed, instead of using additional sample to specifically develop a Y-STR profile or any kind of a Y profile. And the defense says, what does that mean? Bootstrap. Take me back. They have this DNA sample, and then have they done the steps to get their SNP profile before you want bootstrapping done? Or at what stage are you talking about? He says, essentially, it was our understanding that they were in the process of or had already obtained a whole genome sequencing profile. And so our question to them, is there a way to develop a Y-STR profile from the genetic information that you already have through the other method of testing, right? Because we don't want to go back. We don't want to keep using pieces or, our DNA extra. We only have so much. So we don't want to keep using it up. And one thing is you have to use it in initial testing, but you also have to make it available to the defense. Like, you got to have it for court. Remember, we're talking about replicating the process, being able to confirm the same result. Okay, so they have to be circumspect is coming to mind, but cognizant, judicious, sorry, all the wrong words, with not using it all just because they have it, okay? So the defense says, so that's what you mean by bootstrap and a different kind of analysis. Yes. Why would you want to do that? Again, to see if there was a potential to search Y databases that might be available out there to identify genetic lineages. Because yes, there's an interim step here. My detectives, I call it my Y-strike process, and y'all are losing a lot of cases. If you're not doing this, please reach out to me. Okay. So the defense says, what does that mean, genetic lineages? He explains. So a Y chromosome is passed down from father to son. And so we would be looking to see if we can identify a family line through tracking the Y chromosome from father to son to grandfather, all the way down to grandson, and potentially over multiple generations. So it would tie us into a family line that could be investigated further. She says, did Othram bootstrap and get the Y-STR for you? To my knowledge, they never did anything with Y-STR testing, and to my recollection with my discussions with David, that wasn't possible with the data that he had at that point. One test, one test. She says it was impossible, that it was not possible. Correct. Thank you. I do not believe that was attempted. Again, I'm not familiar with the technology that he would have had to use to do such a thing, so I'm not aware if that was possible. If the technology didn't exist, I just don't know. Okay, defense says, at some point, did Othram talk to you about the work they were doing? Yes. And did they have a recommendation? They did. They had at least one recommendation that I remember. When was that conversation? I don't remember exactly when that conversation happened. Well, let's put it between, when did they get the DNA to start with? So they got the DNA November 22nd, I believe. And when were they notified to stop work? I believe the notification, the official notification, was on December 10th, if I remember correctly. So 10 days, maybe 20 days, maybe. Defense says, so when they came back to you with some recommendations, where was that in relation to the stop work? Probably in early December, I'm guessing. The actual work, the laboratory, what I would call the wet work in the laboratory, would be the first couple of weeks, probably before they would have turned it over to a genealogist to be searching in the databases and those sort of things. Defense says, to make sure I'm with you, wet work means DNA sample to where we get the whole genome, sequencing, and then where we get to a SNP. I know I'm skipping steps, but that's the wet work. Correct. The laboratory work. So anything that would be done in the physical laboratory, handling the sample, putting it into tubes, adding liquids, things of that nature, that would be done in the laboratory. Sequencing on an instrument, that would all be done in the first week, several weeks. So why does it take months and months and months and months and months? I have an answer for that, but that's not germane to this video. We will keep going. So the defense continues and says, so after that, they have a recommendation for you. He says, yes. What's their recommendation to you? And here we go. Here we go. Their recommendation, to my memory, to my recall, was that they had several individuals that had the potential to be of interest in this investigation. And they call it reference testing. Which is, anyway, let me go back to the transcript. This is the ISP guy telling us, they asked us if, to further their family tree building, if we could be in contact with individuals and see if they were willing to contribute to the information into the databases that they were using in order to further the family tree building and further it says geological, but it means genealogical work. So this is called, I got to get on my soapbox, this is called reference testing. And that is not how you do forensic genetic genealogy. When you're a true investigator, and this is my opinion, and this is from cases that I work, you don't go throwing Q-tips all around the country and taking reference samples. You build from the data that you have in the databases. Again, I see this all the time, and I don't agree with it. Okay. So now we're getting here, and she's talking about a closed setting, so I might have to go back and cut some of this out here because we don't know what's going to happen here. Because she says we're in a closed setting. So I'm going to ask you to give me the last name. I don't recall the last name. I'm sorry. Was it your understanding that these were 4 brothers? Yes. Okay. What did you do in relationship to these 4 brothers? So, we did some cursory work, just looking in publicly accessible information, literally Google searches and things of that nature. What our approach was is we didn't, no shit Sherlock, sorry. We didn't want to be approaching people, especially with an investigation of this nature that really had nothing to do with anything. And this happens all the time. There's a video, I'm sorry, I gotta stand on my soapbox here. There's a video on Netflix, I believe it is, where they were going to send the detective to the house. I don't know if it's Othram. Somebody was going to send the detective to the house of the serial killer. And this is a cop talking to you. No way. So if you're a cop listening to this, this is not how you conduct an investigation, forensic genetic genealogy. Absolutely, positively, no way. You're putting people in danger. You could be making wrong identifications, and you are putting cops in danger and wasting money and time sending them all around the country. Okay. Sorry, I had to say it. Okay. So this is what he says. We didn't want to be approaching people. This is the police lab. The police people knowing how to do police jobs saying we did not want to be approaching people, especially with a homicide investigation with multiple people, and going to people that they didn't know whether they had to do anything with anything. And that is the disconnect, again, to my detectives or whoever, that is the disconnect between this is why this has to be done in the police department. And you have to know, or you have to have, like I'm a cop, I know what's important to the case. I am, God forbid, not going to risk naming the wrong person or sending a cop into some dangerous situation or increased liability for the police department. The detective needs to know exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it and explain their theory. And this is not happening, okay? Not happening. Also, you work the matches that you already have. You just don't go sending around Q-tips to hope you get lucky. Okay. So this guy here from the lab, he's doing the right thing. He's like, we're not going to just do this. I have to add my other piece here too. This reference testing BS is ruining our pool of cooperative people to assist in these investigations because they're getting burnt out. And this is not how we do police work. We don't speak a word of it until we're ready to make the arrest. Period. Okay. I'm done. And if you want to know what I'm talking about, call me. Okay. So he's saying here, look, we wanted to make sure there was some reason why they were asking us to go and ask these individuals to put their DNA to a database. It sounds like he had no answer for that. Who wants to look like a dummy? Well, the labs, okay? No, this people's DNA. You piss people off when you, this is just all wrong. So he did some cursory work to see what connections they might have and see if they were brothers. And he says things of that nature. Okay. I don't know how long we're going to go here. Okay, we're going to stop here because we're at an hour. Okay. So we're right here that they're telling him, Othram's telling him to go take some Q-tips around. And he's like, I'm not so sure that we like that. Okay?